I'd like to introduce the next panel, Top Economists, Hot Economics. I'd like to give the floor to the moderator, Dr. Alexander Stoikov. He's a professor of economics. Professor, you have the floor.
Thank you. Dear team of Makedonija 2025, dear colleagues, participants, it's indeed my great honor to moderate today's panel titled Hot Economics, Top Economists. It may be a somewhat pretentious title, at least in the light of the personal modesty of our three panelists, very well-known and highly reputable macroeconomists, and well-versed into transition economics and macroeconomics. Professor Vasili Monasteriotis from London School of Economics and Political Science, also a director of the SEE Research Center on Southeastern Europe. Vasili Kalispera or Kalovradi. Professor Trajko Slaveski, professor at the Faculty of Economics at St. Cyril and Methodius University, also former finance minister and former development minister, and president of Skopje City Council. Also my dear professor of macroeconomics. And we have Mr. Peter Senfi, Deputy Director for Country Economics and Policy at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development based in London. Good evening, Peter, and we apologize for the late start of this panel.
Good evening.
The participants can answer an online question regarding the most important macroeconomic issues for our economy in the next year, so please vote. In the meantime, let me apologize for our mistake, for our complete neglect of gender equality for our panel, so I guess Nikica or Galena may mitigate some of the mistake. So let's start. After the pandemic crisis, we are facing another emerging energy crisis, and although this pandemic-induced recession has caused substantial turmoil, many governments have pushed ahead with reform agendas. Therefore, today we will discuss hot economic issues spanning from damage control to economic recovery and resilience. And I can't think of anything hotter in macroeconomics than the imminent energy crisis and the rise in inflation rates. So let's start with Professor Slaveski. Headline: inflation rates have increased rapidly in the United States, in Euro area, and many emerging economies. So are the price pressures expected to become a new normal or a transitory phenomenon in 2022? What's your opinion?
Okay, thank you. Let me first say hello to Peter and Vasily. We have met in my former life with both. We have collaborated on different issues, whether collaboration of the government of Macedonia with EBRD or academic collaboration with the center that is led by Mr. Monasteriotis. This is one of the most topical or hot issues about the nature of inflation recently, whether it is transitory or persistent or more permanent issue. Lately even the top world-known economists, let's say on the top of my knowledge, like Krugman and Summers, they differ and argue whether the nature is more transitory or more persistent. We know, let's say, the stance of the Nobel Prize winner, Paul Krugman, in his column in New York Times, that he thinks that this is something which will not resemble the 70s, the stagflation and high inflation from the 70s. Or, according to him, this would be more like the inflation that followed the World War II, the inflation during 47 and 48, which is, of course, something that is disputed by Summers and others. According from what, let's say, we follow in the press, different analyses, etc., it is difficult to tell. It's hard to tell now at the present moment about the nature, whether it will be transitory, or a more persistent phenomenon, because the current inflation is caused both by, let's say, demand side and supply side shocks. Demand side, you know, the recovery which has started in the global economy and the leading economies of the world. The people with, let's say, increase of the rate of vaccination have become more, let's say, mobile, free, courageous to spend, etc., compared to the period during the lockdowns. But there are problems, of course, on the supply side, and we teach the students that the supply side shocks are very bad news for policymakers. You can't do much. You have to take and live with the consequences. I think that we are facing, we are better to say, we are seeing market failures and government failures on a grand scale. When I say market failures, for example, now take let's say the clogging of the major ports in the world, the ports in China, or in the biggest port in the United States, the one in Long Beach in Los Angeles. The market failure there, which is obvious, which causes lorry drivers, which are in short supply, to wait 9-10 hours in order to pick the load, the container, or change the container. It is caused by low investment, or the lack of incentives for investment on the part of the private owners of the facilities in the ports. On the other hand, the government is not helpful. For example, this same port in Long Beach, which I take as an example, there is a government regulation that you cannot stack more than 2 containers, one above the other. So no space. Lorry drivers wait for hours and days outside of the port. So this is something that creates supply shock. Now, the problem is, I will finish with this. Now, how will central banks react? You know, not only you mentioned the headline inflation, but I'm more worried about the core or underlying rate of inflation. And I will take only the example of Macedonia. Our inflation, according to the Statistical Office, the headline inflation, or CPI inflation, month to month, let's say yearly inflation, October this year, October last year, was 6.1%, close to the one in the United States. But what is worrisome for Macedonia is the increase lately in the last couple of years of the core inflation from minus 0.3 in 2019 to more than 3% expected this year. So I will finish with this. Let's not forget the push for increase of wages. In some countries, of course, because of the labor shortage and some other factors, political, etc., wages rise. Let's remind ourselves that the original Phillips curve curve dealt with wage inflation, not price inflation. And this is something that is peculiar for Macedonia, because on the part of the government, there has been lately push for increase of wages using the minimum wage as an instrument.
Thank you. And once we mentioned the recovery, I would like to ask Mr. Sanfi from EBRD, can the pandemic serve as a catalyst for system upgrades? Is the region ready for moving from damage control to strengthening the economic recovery and resilience? What's the perspective of the EBRD?
Thanks very much, Alexander, and may I say what a great pleasure it is to be on this panel and with old friends Trico and Vasilis. I should stress I'm going to give my own view here. It's informed, of course, by my long experience in the EBRD, but it's a personal. Anything I say is a personal opinion, and I think if you look at the growth rates this year, they look pretty good. I mean, we've just come out with some forecasts of, on average for the Western Balkans, 6.4% growth in 2021. So it's more or less a full rebound, or even more than a full rebound in relative to the recession last year. But the region is still well behind. I mean, a few years ago, together with a colleague, we did some scenarios of how long it might take for Western Balkans to catch up with the EU average. And one scenario was it would take 4 decades. And when we told that to people, they said, "Oh, God, that's an awful long time." And we said, no, that's the optimistic scenario. There's a maybe more realistic scenario, which is that it's maybe 60 years, and a pessimistic one was 200 years. And of course, a lot of the journalists picked up on this paper and took the 200-year perspective. So I'm an optimist, and I think it can happen within some decades. But what I have felt for a long time, following, being a bit of a veteran in this region, is that there's really a lack of long-term strategic thinking about what is it really that the countries like North Macedonia or the other ones in the region have to offer, and how are they going to get there? Not next year, but really in 10, 20, 30 years' time. And what I and my colleagues at the EBRD have tried to push in recent years is to think of this in terms of what are the qualities of a successful market economy, and we have boiled it down to 6 qualities. A successful economy would be competitive, well-governed, green, inclusive, resilient, and integrated. And we've developed a methodology to measure countries where they stand on each of these, which you can apply to any country. We apply it to some advanced Western economies, and we published this in our annual transition report, which has just come out, by the way, the new one. And if you look at the Western Balkans, it's things like governance and green where there are really major gaps. So I think to really focus on long-term recovery, you need to have a proper diagnosis of why the country lags behind where it wants to be. We all know these countries want to be not just in the European Union, but fully up to the living standards of the European Union. And that's why I would say there really should be a strong focus on governance. I think these countries are being held back by the lack of a proper, well-functioning public administration, the lack of an independent civil service, the fact that, when governments change, the whole civil service at the top tends to change and you don't get continuity. That's very off-putting to investors, and it's ultimately investment that this region needs. And it won't be attracted by gimmicks or a race to the bottom of tax incentives, but it will be attracted by stability, good governance, and a competitive environment, an open environment, a resilient environment that will allow then companies to compete on the global stage.
Thank you.
Let me stop at that point and then go back to you, Alexander.
Thank you. Vasily, as the recovery picked up steam in the second half of 2021, some producers found themselves unable to ramp up sufficient supply again quickly, For example, microchip production relative to demand remains hampered. There are also significant delays in international shipping, as Professor Slavesky mentioned. And we have here an important automotive component industry which suffers from delays in imported inputs. Do you expect that these supply bottlenecks may continue in the next year?
Alexander, thank you for the question, and very happy to be in the panel. Greetings to all colleagues there, and of course to people in the audience. I mean, we live in highly uncertain times, and we still don't know whether we are actually exiting the COVID pandemic or if a new wave will come as we go closer to to the Christmas period and so forth. Of course, we built a lot of resilience, and although the problems in the supply chain and also problems domestically in policy and in the health sector remain in large parts of the world. Actually, we have built both the mechanisms and the policies to try to mitigate some of these problems. So, although there's a lot of uncertainty, I think that, of course, the hiccups and the problems will remain. They will not be, if you want, solved automatically in the turn of the new year. But I do not think. But I think we're seeing really the kind of the back end of the disruption. It will take time, and it will take time not only because naturally it takes time to for things to go back to normal, but also because we have disruptive developments in terms of how companies and whole sectors have responded to the COVID pandemic, with introducing new or accelerating the introduction of automation, of new technologies, but also disruption in the sense that we have sectoral shifts and sectoral shifts that have not actually fully materialized yet. So we have a lot of, if you want, resources, labor, perhaps also capital, also technology, which are quite misallocated at the moment, and we're in a transition phase. So there will be a continuing, hiccups and problems in the supply chain, I think, for a long time. And of course, we don't know what else is going to happen. We're used now in the last decade or so of kind of almost a permanent reappearance of different crises. So we don't know what is around the corner. But things, I think, are they allow some sort of, if I may say, reasonable optimism, but you also have to exercise caution and to understand that things are not going to be fully improved instantaneously. I think a lesson from this is that then, there's some sort of power in unity, and that, especially for the small countries that we have in the Western Balkans, it is very important to proceed with the regional market integration, to strengthen within the region the linkages, the business linkages, cross-border linkages, because then that not only gives you a bigger mass, a bigger size, and probably different alternative, to some degree, alternative supply sources, but also it gives you a bigger influence, bigger visibility, and you can sort of resolve collectively problems in the supply chain, even if these problems come from exogenous factors and obviously from the international supply chain.
Thank you. And even though economic recovery itself is a tremendous task, many international financial institutions suggest to link the economic recovery with new growth opportunities related to technology, climate change, digitalization. Mr. Senfi, there was a recent EBRD transition report devoted to delivering the digital dividend, outlining the digital divides across countries and within countries. So will, let's say, the presumably faster pace of digitalization also help the economic recovery, given that it may also stimulate digital brain drain?
Yes, that's a very good question. We tried to at least begin to address some of this in our new transition report. Again, I would be quite optimistic about this. I think for countries like North Macedonia, the digital agenda is really one of opportunity. increases, if used properly, increases the chances of catching up. And I would link it also to the green agenda. The green and digital, I think, should be seen as two complementary agendas. The adoption of new technology in both areas are really, this is really now the opportunity for these countries to take advantage of the new technologies that are coming out, take advantage of the investment opportunities that are in place and that institutions like ours are trying to promote, and really pursue this agenda vigorously, without forgetting, of course, the inclusion agenda, making sure that all parts of the society are brought along. We've heard a lot about the just transition in the green space. I think also in the digital space, it's important to ensure that the digital divide is narrowing rather than growing. That's going to be extremely important for economies to be successful.
Thank you. Do we have responses from the audience?
Alexander, may I just
yes, please.
jump into this?
While we're dealing
the previous session dealt with digitalization. Now with all the problems that we are faced with, we see the importance of the real world, real economy. You can't eat bites. 3 years ago, many governments were making plans how to retrain lorry drivers, how to, let's say, support them with income, with social security, etc., because everybody thought that in few years' time, we'll not need lorry drivers because we will have driverless lorries. And now there is a huge shortage of lorry drivers. You can't find them. Great Britain is faced with this problem, United States, and all over the world. Digitalization is quite important about, let's say, planning the processes, etc. But we know that moving of real goods and the last mile for delivery of the goods takes a lot of resources.
In the meantime, there are results on the big screen. So high inflation, energy crisis, and low productivity rank high on the agenda, on the list of most imminent problems for the next year. So let's say regarding the low productivity, governments are focused on facing health, socioeconomic, and fiscal emergencies. But do they forget the human capital formation? Vasily, what do you think? Have they neglected the human capital agenda in the past 20 months or so?
Thanks, Alexander. Of course, yeah, also the issue of unemployment is there, and the issue of skills would be there, I'm pretty sure. Of course, I mean, you cannot blame governments for focusing in, putting their attention on the emergency issues. And of course, above all, that was a health crisis and if you want, socioeconomic crisis. We know that poverty increased quite dramatically with the pandemic and with the lockdown measures and everything. And of course, the governments had priority to manage the health, the spread of the virus, the vaccination program, and of course, the hospitalizations, the provision of care to the citizens. So of course, you cannot blame governments, actually not only the Balkans, but everywhere, for prioritizing on these things. I think it is not so much that governments did not do or forgot about human capital and skills. I think it is that now they face new and additional challenges. In some way, governments did the furloughing schemes, kept people in jobs, even if haphazardly. They did the online classrooms for schools. So they tried to keep the education and the skill formation going. However, we have the crisis created these two shocks in terms of skills formation and human capital. On the one hand, the shock of essentially skills depletion because people became unemployed, so they do not use their skills. Even people that stayed in jobs where they were furloughed, they were inactive essentially within the job. Also, they get a detachment by not using the skills, but also they miss on potential accumulation of experience and skills. So there's a period of time which doesn't count in terms of skill formation within, which happens day in, day out in the factories, in the offices, and everywhere else. And of course, in a similar way, also the school, the formal education provision, because you have a substitute through online teaching, but it's not the same as face-to-face class interaction and the learning that happens in a more tacit way. And of course, this may be a temporary thing, but also it may well has more permanent effects because we're talking about sort of removing a part of investment in human capital from our economies. The other thing is relating also to what Professor Slavesi was saying just now about the skills with the lorry drivers, the example of lorry drivers. And, the crisis also represents a problem of skills disruption, that we have new mismatches, we have shifts in the demand for skills and different competencies that can be required. And that is very difficult for governments to manage to identify and to respond to very, very quickly. I think this comes on top of the other problems that we know, the problem of unemployment, and perhaps more so now structural unemployment, but also low employment participation, youth unemployment, and other things. So there's a number of things that governments can do, but these are not things that are either very cheap or they produce very quick results. I don't know if I should stop here and pass the floor maybe to Peter, because I know he has to leave quite soon, and then I can come back to a couple of points that I would like to raise.
Okay, Mr.
Yeah,
Serfi.
nothing to add from my side at this point, and I do apologize to everyone. I will have to leave in a couple of minutes, so sorry about that.
So, governments have praised themselves for the large fiscal packages that avoided deep recessions or even economic depression. But this comes with a price, with very high budget deficit, elevated public debts. So, on one hand, other experts warn about the risk of premature fiscal consolidation, which means very strong and sudden cuts in the budget deficits that may harm the economic recovery. So, what if the country has a limited fiscal space to finance another round of fiscal stimulus? What is your opinion on the appropriate fiscal policy in the coming period? Professor Slavesky, maybe.
Because Alexander, you remember the lectures on budget constraints of the government, fiscal budget constraints. So we have to have that in mind. But
the intertemporal.
Thinking globally. I think that in our lifetime we might have not seen such a challenge for the proper mix of monetary and fiscal policy now, particularly let's say the last 2 or 3 quarters with the rising inflation. There are a lot of contradictions, and which has narrowed the choices of the governments in the near future. For example, central banks cannot sit idle, and they have started, let's say, to think about tightening the monetary policy, whether to, let's say, to cease with this unconventional measures of quantitative easing, or even some have started to increase the, let's say, the interest rates. To what extent the governors of the central banks will be courageous to take proper measures to increase the rates, it depends on the pressures that the same governments put on the central bank. And once again, we will come to the issue of independence of central banks. To remind you, if we go back to the, let's say, lessons of the 70s, the inflation in the United States started to increase in late 60s, 70s, etc. It took Paul Walker, who broke the back of the inflation, which was for the United States rather high, close to 20%. Now, The governments on their side cannot resist, let's say, assisting monetary policy with reducing the budgetary deficits. And this will be interesting episode, and it will be interesting to follow. What I can expect is that nothing will come or nothing will be implemented on timely. There will be lags in taking the measures. I'm not talking about the lags of the measures themselves, but not taking measures on time, which will lead to increased inflation. And high inflation probably is here to stay even during the next year, at least.
Vasily, would you comment on the fiscal policies that are appropriate in the coming period? Whether
Yes, yeah, I mean, I can say that I usually try to stay out of fiscal policy because I'm one of the people who advocate a lot of spending. So, but I think, you know, the news that are coming from the projections about the bounce back of the economies are very encouraging, because, of course, if the economy bounces back, then, of course, you know, if you want the denominator increases, so your fiscal space opens up. What happens with inflation and how central banks respond, and I think also how coordinated is the response, at least you know, in the OECD world, if not globally, I think is a very important issue, because of course you cannot accommodate on the one hand with fiscal policy, and on the other hand kind of jeopardize that through monetary policy. So there has to be some policy coordination there. But to the extent that growth is very strong, the bounce back is very strong, both in the region and at least in Europe, then I think that will ease a lot of the concerns, both with regard to the conduct of monetary policy, but also with regard to how businesses feel about fiscal expansion or legacy fiscal deficits in different parts of the world. I think the problem starts when you combine the energy crisis and the supply side bottlenecks that we mentioned already with sluggish growth. Then all questions are opening up, everybody panics, and then the fiscal space is reduced, even if fiscal capacity domestically is there. You know, if the financial markets are nervous, then you have to be over cautious with your fiscal policy.
You mentioned the energy crisis. A question for all of you: how imminent is the energy crisis? How important it is? Did we start to pay the price for decades of neglect of investment, actually underinvestment in the energy infrastructure? Because experts warn that this will be a huge adverse shock on the supply side. So, what's your opinion about the magnitude of the forthcoming energy crisis in Europe? It's not only in our country, but also in Europe.
Because I think that I have taken quite a, let's say, a lot of time during the discussion. I will illustrate this with a well-known Macedonian proverb, which says, dig a new well, but do not spit in the old one. And I think that everybody in the audience knows the meaning of this old wisdom.
Okay. Do we have questions from the audience, maybe? Yes, please, Nikita.
And one of them is about the Open Balkan Initiative. Can it bring economic benefits to the region? The other one is, as economists, what is your opinion on the blockchain technologies? Will they disrupt the economic system? Will they change the economy?
Well, I think Vasily is very well versed in economic geography, so maybe some insights into and expectations about the Open Balkan Initiative.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Alexander. For the moment, I thought you'd tell me about blockchain technology, and I'm afraid I wouldn't be able to. to do much on this. So Open Balkan Initiative, kind of mini Schengen, let me say also regional economic area, common market, connectivity agenda, all these things that try to, both on the political level and on the, if you want, on the economic level, to integrate the Balkan space, the Western Balkan space. I think they are important. You can ask very critical questions, as personally I have done, and also many colleagues studying the region have done over the years. You can ask questions about, is this serving a domestic agenda, or is it serving somebody else's agenda, you know, a European agenda, for example? Is it excuse me, a way moving forward into Europeanization and European integration and integration with kind of the global economy? Or is it instead some sort of permanent waiting room, parallel process, and so forth? So you can ask many critical questions about these things. But at the end of the day, we see how many challenges globally exist that can threaten the region, and how important it is to have mechanisms for collective action at the interstate level, at the international level. So how different the European Union, for example, looks today, after they managed to put together the recovery fund, and after they managed to coordinate the procurement of vaccines, compared to the first wave of the pandemic, where the European Union seemed like this like a schoolyard of different kids trying to do different things, and there was no coordination, there was no coherence, if you want, policy coherence. So, you know, if for the European Union it is important, for the countries, the member states of the European Union, it is important to pull resources together and to organize the collective action together, then of course it must be doubly important, even more important for the countries of the Western Balkans to do that. Both because they have the legacy and the history of the negative connotations, but because also the scale, the domestic capacities are much more disadvantageous compared to countries or some countries in the European Union. So I think this is, you know, of course, everything that tries to integrate the economy and also society and remove political and historical obstacles to cooperation must be seen as something good. I want to say something here that, you know, this is not, I wrote many years ago something, a discussion paper, never got published, that was saying about, is this idea about regional cooperation against European integration, or is there other synergies? And I think that is the main message that has to stay there, that now it is clear more than ever, and I think even with the latest, you know, with the 2021 enlargement package and everything, it is clear more than ever, I think, that regional cooperation is not just on the nominally as a token, in a token level, a means for European integration. It is the only way for European integration. There's no way that, you know, countries in the Western Balkans can proceed European integration, either economically or politically, without further integration at the regional level. I think this is now inevitable, and I think, in my sense, is that in general the political classes in the Western Balkans understand this, and that's why I'm quite optimistic that this, not only these things are going to continue, but also they're going to continue in a positive direction, so they're going to be done correctly, so to speak.
Do you think that the stalled or prolonged EU integration, the postponed start of negotiations for EU accession, will affect countries' motivation for institutional and structural reforms? Maybe a question for both of you. Yes, please.
As a person living in the region, not someone who has the, let's say, the privilege to look at the issues from outside and be, of course, more objective. Of course, I'm very much in favor of any initiative that increases the integration of the regional economies and cooperation, because we all know as economists that around the world, economic, let's say, cooperation and trade is the most intensive between neighbors. take a look, let's say, the trade of Switzerland with neighboring countries, with Germany, with France, and other countries. So
the gravity model.
It will be beneficial. Of course, it will not be by any means a substitute for full EU integration. And I of course think that, let's say, this process of regional integration may speed up the process of EU integration, prepare the countries more, let's say, to satisfy the criteria to be functional market economies and to have economic subjects which are able to compete on the common market. Blockchain, shortly. There was a question.
Okay.
I'm not an expert, but you know, we heard previously here something from an economist, which is let's say a lay person in this area. Of course, it's a marvelous new technology, which will have many let's say fields of implementation in the future. The blockchain technology. The blockchain technology has become synonymous, but at least in our region, with Bitcoin and other crypto assets. You know, I teach my students to forget cryptocurrency, the word, because you know it's not this let's say assets. These are assets, not currencies, because they do not satisfy the definition and functions of money. And I agree with those, let's say, knowledgeable people that think that the long-term value of these currencies, including the leading Bitcoin, is zero. Because it's a zero-sum game, you know, it's a zero-sum game. But my position is, I have been thinking lately, and I compare it to, let's say, a phenomenon of rock and roll for all the people in this room. Many people did not like it. Many people liked it, you know, enjoyed. Many enjoyed the good features of this, let's say, of this movement, of this fashion. Many were victims of, let's say, of bad consequences, like, let's say, drugs, etc., etc. But now we have to come to the issue of regulation. And regulation, process of regulation and preparation of regulation has started. Of course, the leading nations in the United States, Gary Gensler, the chief of the Security and Exchange Commission, who is taught at MIT about, let's say, crypto assets, is, let's say, proposing regulation that these assets cannot be excluded from other assets which are regulated. I mean here, let's say, like shares, bonds, etc.
Thank you. Yeah, let me try to summarize these hot issues, because the sample of respondents is dominated by business sector representatives. So it's obvious that high inflation, energy crisis, low productivity rank high as most imminent problems. But from a macroeconomic point of view, policymakers are also concerned with elevated public debts, with difficulties in combating pandemic crisis, and other imminent energy crisis. So it's a very difficult time for policymakers and for macroeconomists. I would like to thank all the discussants for the wonderful comments and insights. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you, and we hope we see next year in person and discuss even more passionately. Time's up, so thank you.
Thank you, Alexander, also for me, and many greetings to Tycho, and hope to have the opportunity next year to join you in person. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you.
Bye. Okay.